The Magician, a novel by Somerset Maugham, Part 1, a fragment of autobiography. In 1897, after spending 5 years at St. Thomas's Hospital, I passed the examinations which enabled me to practice medicine. While still a medical student, I had published a novel called Liza of Lambeth, which caused a mild sensation, and on the strength of that, I rashly decided to abandon doctoring and earn my living as a writer. So, as soon as I was qualified, I set out for Spain and spent the best part of a year in Seville. I amused myself hugely and wrote a bad novel. Then I returned to London and, with a friend of my own age, took and furnished a small flat near Victoria Station. A maid-of-all-work cooked for us and kept the flat neat and tidy. My friend was at the bar, and so I had the day and the flat to myself and my work. During the next 6 years, I wrote several novels and a number of plays. Only one of these novels had any success, but even that failed to make the stir that my first one had made. I could get no manager to take my plays. At last, in desperation, I sent one, which I called A Man of Honour, to the Stage Society, which gave 2 performances, one on Sunday night, another on Monday afternoon, of plays which, unsuitable for the commercial theatre, were considered of sufficient merit to please an intellectual audience. As everyone knows, it was the Stage Society that produced the early plays of Bernard Shaw. The committee accepted A Man of Honour, and W.L. Courtney, who was a member of it, thought well enough of my crude play to publish it in the Fortnightly Review, of which he was then editor. It was a feather in my cap. Though these efforts of mine brought me very little money, they attracted not a little attention, and I made friends. I was looked upon as a promising young writer, and I think I may say it without vanity, was accepted as a member of the intelligentsia, an honourable condition which, some years later, when I became a popular writer of light comedies, I lost, and have never since regained. I was invited to literary parties, and to parties given by women of rank and fashion who thought it behoved them to patronize the arts. An unattached and fairly presentable young man is always in demand. I lunched out and dined out. Since I could not afford to take cabs when I dined out in tails and a white tie, as was then the custom, I went and came back by bus. I was asked to spend weekends in the country. They were something of a trial on account of the tips you had to give to the butler and to the footman who brought you your morning tea. He unpacked your Gladstone bag, and you were uneasily aware that your well-worn pyjamas and modest toilet articles had made an unfavourable impression upon him. For all that, I found life pleasant and I enjoyed myself. There seemed no reason why I should not go on indefinitely in the same way, bringing out a novel once a year, which seldom earned more than the small advance the publisher had given me, but which was on the whole respectably reviewed, going to more and more parties, making more and more friends. It was all very nice, but I couldn't see that it was leading me anywhere. I was 30. I was in a rut. I felt I must get out of it. It did not take me long to make up my mind. I told the friend with whom I shared the flat that I wanted to be rid of it and go abroad. He could not keep it by himself, but we luckily found a middle-aged gentleman who wished to install his mistress in it and was prepared to take it off our hands. We sold the furniture for what it could fetch, and within a month I was on my way to Paris. I took a room in a cheap hotel on the left bank. A few months before this, I had been fortunate enough to make friends with a young painter who had a studio in the Rue Campagne Première. His name was Gerald Kelly. He had had an upbringing unusual for a painter, for he had been to Eton and to Cambridge. He was highly talented, abundantly loquacious, and immensely enthusiastic. It was he who first made me acquainted with the Impressionists, whose pictures had recently been accepted by the Luxembourg. To my shame, I must admit that I could not make head or tail of them. Without much searching, I found an apartment on the 5th floor of a house near the Lion de Belfort. It had 2 rooms and a kitchen and cost 700 francs a year, which was then £28. I bought Second-hand, such furniture and household utensils as were essential, and the concierge told me of a woman who would come in for half a day and make my café au lait in the morning and my luncheon at noon. I settled down and set to work on still another novel. Soon after my arrival, Gerald Kelly took me to a restaurant called Le Chat Blanc in the Rue d'Odessa, near the Gare Montparnasse, where a number of artists were in the habit of dining, and from then on I dined there every night. I have described the place elsewhere, and in some detail in the novel, to which these pages are meant to serve as a preface, so that I need not here say more about it. As a rule, the same people came in every night, but now and then others came, perhaps only once, perhaps 2 or 3 times. We were apt to look upon them as interlopers, and I don't think we made them particularly welcome. It was thus that I first met Arnold Bennett and Clive Bell. One of these casual visitors was Aleister Crowley. He was spending the winter in Paris. I took an immediate dislike to him, but he interested and amused me. He was a great talker, and he talked uncommonly well. In early youth, I was told, he was extremely handsome, but when I knew him, he had put on weight, and his hair was thinning. He had fine eyes and a way, whether natural or acquired, I do not know, of so focusing them that when he looked at you, he seemed to look behind you. He was a fake, but not entirely a fake. At Cambridge, he had won his chess blue and was esteemed the best whist player of his time. He was a liar and unbecomingly boastful, but the odd thing was that he had actually done some of the things he boasted of. As a mountaineer, he had made an ascent of K2 in the Hindu Kush, the second highest mountain in India, and he made it without the elaborate equipment, the cylinders of oxygen and so forth, which render the endeavors of the mountaineers of the present day more likely to succeed. He did not reach the top, but got nearer to it than anyone had done before. Crowley was a voluminous writer of verse, which he published sumptuously at his own expense. He had a gift for rhyming, and his verse is not entirely without merit. He had been greatly influenced by Swinburne and Robert Browning. He was grossly, but not unintelligently, imitative. As you flip through the pages, you may well read a stanza which, if you came across it in a volume of Swinburne's, you would accept without question as the work of the master. It's rather hard, isn't it, sir, to make sense of it? If you were shown this line and asked what poet had written it, I think you would be inclined to say, Robert Browning. You would be wrong. It was written by Aleister Crowley. At the time I knew him, he was dabbling in Satanism, magic, and the occult. There was just then something of a vogue in Paris for that sort of thing, occasioned, I surmise, by the interest that was still taken in a book of Heisman's, La Basse. Crowley told fantastic stories of his experiences, but it was hard to say whether he was telling the truth or merely pulling your leg. During that winter, I saw him several times, but never after I left Paris to return to London. Once, long afterwards, I received a telegram from him which ran as follows: "Please send £25 at once. Mother of God and I starving. Aleister Crowley." I did not do so, and he lived on for many disgraceful years. I was glad to get back to London. My old friend had by then rooms in Pall Mall, and I was able to take a bedroom in the same building and use his sitting room to work in. The Magician was published in 1908, so I suppose it was written during the first 6 months of 1907. I do not remember how I came to think that Aleister Crowley might serve as the model for the character whom I called Oliver Haddo, nor indeed how I came to think of writing that particular novel at all. When a little while ago my publisher expressed a wish to reissue it, I felt that, before consenting to this, I really should read it again. Nearly 50 years had passed since I had done so, and I had completely forgotten it. Some authors enjoy reading their old works, some cannot bear to. Of these I am. When I have corrected the proofs of a book, I have finished with it for good and all. I am impatient when people insist on talking to me about it. I am glad if they like it, but do not much care if they don't. I am no more interested in it than in a worn-out suit of clothes that I have given away. It was thus, with disinclination, that I began to read The Magician. It held my interest as two of my early novels, which for the same reason I have been obliged to read, did not. One, indeed, I simply could not get through. Another had to my mind some good dramatic scenes, but the humour filled me with mortification, and I should have been ashamed to see it republished. As I read The Magician, I wondered how on earth I could have come by all the material concerning the black arts which I wrote of. I must have spent days and days reading in the library of the British Museum. The style is lush and turgid, not at all the sort of style I approve of now, but perhaps not unsuited to the subject, and there are a great many more adverbs and adjectives than I should use today. I fancy I must have been impressed by the écriture artiste which the French writers of the time had not yet entirely abandoned and unwisely sought to imitate them. Though Aleister Crowley served, as I have said, as the model for Oliver Haddo, it is by no means a portrait of him. I made my character more striking in appearance, more sinister and more ruthless than Crowley ever was. I gave him magical powers that Crowley, though he claimed them, certainly never possessed. Crowley, however, recognized himself in the creature of my invention, for such it was, and wrote a full-page review of the novel in Vanity Fair, which he signed Oliver Haddo. I didn't read it, and wish now that I had. I dare say it was a pretty piece of vituperation, but probably, like his poems, intolerably verbose. I do not remember what success, if any, my novel had when it was published, and I did not bother about it much, for by then a great change had come into my life. The manager of the Court Theatre, one Otho Stewart, had brought out a play which failed to please, and he could not immediately get the cast he wanted for the next play he had in mind to produce. He had read one of mine and formed a very poor opinion of it, but he was in a quandary, and it occurred to him that it might just serve to keep his theatre open for a few weeks, by the end of which the actors he wanted for the play he had been obliged to postpone would be at liberty. He put mine on. It was an immediate success. The result of this was that in a very little while other managers accepted the plays they had consistently refused, and I had 4 running in London at the same time. I, who for 10 years had earned an average of £100 a year, found myself earning several £100s a week. I made up my mind to abandon the writing of novels for the rest of my life. I did not know that this was something out of my control, and that when the urge to write a novel seized me, I should be able to do nothing but submit. 5 years later, the urge came, and refusing to write any more plays for the time, I started upon the longest of all my novels. I called it Of Human Bondage. Chapter 1. Arthur Burdon and Dr. Porhoët walked in silence. They had lunched at a restaurant in the Boulevard Saint-Michel and were sauntering now in the gardens of the Luxembourg. Dr. Porhoët walked with stooping shoulders, his hands behind him. He beheld the scene with the eyes of the many painters who have sought by means of the most charming garden in Paris to express their sense of beauty. The grass was scattered with the fallen leaves, but their wan decay little served to give a touch of nature to the artifice of all besides. The trees were neatly surrounded by bushes, and the bushes by trim beds of flowers. But the trees grew without abandonment, as though conscious of the decorative scheme they helped to form. It was autumn, and some were leafless already. Many of the flowers were withered. The formal garden reminded one of a light woman, no longer young, who sought, with faded finery, with powder and paint, to make a brave show of despair. It had those false, difficult smiles of uneasy gaiety, and the pitiful graces which attempt a fascination that the hurrying years have rendered vain. Dr. Porhoët drew more closely round his fragile body the heavy cloak which even in summer he could not persuade himself to discard. The best part of his life had been spent in Egypt, in the practice of medicine, and the frigid summers of Europe scarcely warmed his blood. His memory flashed for an instant upon those multicolored streets of Alexandria, and then, like a homing bird, it flew to the green woods and the storm-beaten coasts of his native Brittany. His brown eyes were veiled with sudden melancholy. "Let us wait here for a moment," he said. They took 2 straw-bottomed chairs and sat near the octagonal water which completes with its fountain of cupids the enchanting artificiality of the Luxembourg. The sun shone more kindly now, and the trees which framed the scene were golden and lovely. A balustrade of stone gracefully enclosed the space, and the flowers, freshly bedded, were very gay. In one corner they could see the squat, quaint towers of St. Sulpice, and on the other side the uneven roofs of the Boulevard Saint-Michel. The palace was grey and solid. Nurses, some in the white caps of their native province, others with the satin streamers of the nounou, marched sedately 2 by 2, wheeling perambulators and talking. Brightly dressed children trundled hoops or whipped a stubborn top. As he watched them, Dr. Porhoët's lips broke into a smile, and it was so tender that his thin face, sallow from long exposure to subtropical suns, was transfigured. He no longer struck you merely as an insignificant little man with hollow cheeks and a thin grey beard, for the weariness of expression which was habitual to him vanished before the charming sympathy of his smile. His sunken eyes glittered with a kindly but ironic good humour, now past a guard in the romantic cloak of a brigand in comic opera and a peaked cap like that of an alguacil. A group of telegraph boys in blue stood round a painter who was making a sketch, notwithstanding half-frozen fingers. Here and there, in baggy corduroys, tight jackets, and wide-brimmed hats, strolled students who might have stepped from the page of Murger's immortal romance. But the students now are uneasy with the fear of ridicule, and more often they walk in bowler hats and the neat coats of the boulevardier. Dr. Porhoët spoke English fluently, with scarcely a trace of foreign accent, but with an elaboration which suggested that he had learned the language as much from study of the English classics as from conversation. "And how is Miss Dauncey?" he asked, turning to his friend. Arthur Burdon smiled. "Oh, I expect she's all right. I've not seen her today, but I'm going to tea at the studio this afternoon, and we want you to dine with us at the Chien Noir." "I shall be much pleased. But do you not wish to be by yourselves?" "She met me at the station yesterday, and we dined together. We talked steadily from 6:30 till midnight. Or rather, she talked, and you listened with the delighted attention of a happy lover." Arthur Burdon had just arrived in Paris. He was a surgeon on the staff of St. Luke's S, and had come ostensibly to study the methods of the French operators, but his real object was certainly to see Margaret Dauncey. He was furnished with introductions from London's surgeons of repute, and had already spent a morning at the Hotel Dieu, where the operator, warned that his visitor was a bold and skilful surgeon, whose reputation in England was already considerable, had sought to dazzle him by feats that savoured almost of legerdemain. Though the hint of charlatanry in the Frenchman's methods had not escaped Arthur Burdon's shrewd eyes, the audacious sureness of his hand had excited his enthusiasm. During luncheon he talked of nothing else, and Dr. Porhoët, drawing upon his memory, recounted the more extraordinary operations that he had witnessed in Egypt. He had known Arthur Burdon ever since he was born, and indeed had missed being present at his birth only because the Khedive Ismail had summoned him unexpectedly to Cairo. But the Levantine merchant, who was Arthur's father, had been his most intimate friend, and it was with singular pleasure that Dr. Porhoët saw the young man, on his advice, enter his own profession and achieve a distinction which himself had never won. Though too much interested in the characters of the persons whom chance threw in his path to have much ambition on his own behalf, it pleased him to see it in others. He observed with satisfaction the pride which Arthur took in his calling and the determination, backed by his confidence and talent, to become a master of his art. Dr. Porhoët knew that a diversity of interests, though it adds charm to a man's personality, tends to weaken him. To excel one's fellows, it is needful to be circumscribed. He did not regret, therefore, that Arthur in many ways was narrow. Letters and the arts meant little to him, nor would he trouble himself with the graceful trivialities which make a man a good talker. In mixed company, he was content to listen silently to others, and only something very definite to say could tempt him to join in the general conversation. He worked very hard, operating, dissecting, or lecturing at his hospital, and took pains to read every word, not only in English, but in French and German, which was published concerning his profession. Whenever he could snatch a free day, he spent it on the golf links of Sunningdale, for he was an eager and a fine player. But at the operating table, Arthur was different. He was no longer the awkward man of social intercourse, who was sufficiently conscious of his limitations not to talk of what he did not understand, and sincere enough not to express admiration for what he did not like. Then, on the other hand, a singular exhilaration filled him. He was conscious of his power, and he rejoiced in it. No unforeseen accident was able to confuse him. He seemed to have a positive instinct for operating, and his hand and his brain worked in a manner that appeared almost automatic. He never hesitated, and he had no fear of failure. His success had been no less than his courage, and it was plain that soon his reputation with the public would equal that which he had already won with the profession. Dr. Porhoët had been making listless patterns with his stick upon the gravel, and now, with that charming smile of his, turned to Arthur. "I never cease to be astonished at the unexpectedness of human nature," he remarked. "It is really very surprising that a man like you should fall so deeply in love with a girl like Margaret Dauncey." Arthur made no reply, and Dr. Porhoët, fearing that his words might offend, hastened to explain. "You know as well as I do that I think her a very charming young person. She has beauty and grace and sympathy. But your characters are more different than chalk and cheese. Notwithstanding your birth in the East and your boyhood, spent amid the very scenes of the 1001 Nights, you are the most matter-of-fact creature I have ever come across." "I see no harm in your saying insular," smiled Arthur. "I confess that I have no imagination and no sense of humor. I am a plain, practical man, but I can see to the end of my nose with extreme clearness. Fortunately, it is rather a long one. One of my cherished ideas is that it is impossible to love without imagination." Again Arthur Burdon made no reply, but a curious look came into his eyes as he gazed in front of him. It was the look which might fill the passionate eyes of a mystic when he saw in ecstasy the divine lady of his constant prayers. But Miss Dauncey has none of that narrowness of outlook which, if you forgive my saying so, is perhaps the secret of your strength. She has a delightful enthusiasm for every form of art. Beauty really means as much to her as bread and butter to the more soberly minded. And she takes a passionate interest in the variety of life. It is right that Margaret should care for beauty, since there is beauty in every inch of her, answered Arthur. He was too reticent to proceed to any analysis of his feelings, but he knew that he had cared for her first on account of the physical perfection which contrasted so astonishingly with the countless deformities in the study of which his life was spent. But one phrase escaped him almost against his will. "The first time I saw her, I felt as though a new world had opened to my ken." The divine music of Keats's lines rang through Arthur's remark, and to the Frenchman's mind gave his passion a romantic note that foreboded future tragedy. He sought to dispel the cloud which his fancy had cast upon the most satisfactory of love affairs. "You are very lucky, my friend. Miss Margaret admires you as much as you adore her. She is never tired of listening to my prosy stories of your childhood in Alexandria, and I'm quite sure that she will make you the most admirable of wives." "You can't be more sure than I am," laughed Arthur. He looked upon himself as a happy man. He loved Margaret with all his heart, and he was confident in her great affection for him. It was impossible that anything should arise to disturb the pleasant life which they had planned together. His love cast a glamour upon his work, and his work, by contrast, made love the more entrancing. "We're going to fix the date of our marriage now," he said. "I'm buying furniture already." "I think only English people could have behaved so oddly as you in postponing your marriage without reason for 2 mortal years. You see, Margaret was 10 when I first saw her, and only 17 when I asked her to marry me. She thought she had reason to be grateful to me and would have married me there and then. But I knew she hankered after these 2 years in Paris, and I didn't feel it was fair to bind her to me till she had seen at least something of the world. And she seemed hardly ready for marriage. She was growing still." "Did I not say that you were a matter-of-fact young man?" smiled Dr. Porhoët. "And it's not as if there had been any doubt about our knowing our minds. We both cared, and we had a long time before us. We could afford to wait." At that moment a man strolled past them, a big stout fellow, showily dressed in a check suit, and he gravely took off his hat to Dr. Porhoët. The doctor smiled and returned the salute. "Who is your fat friend?" asked Arthur. "That is a compatriot of yours. His name is Oliver Haddo." "Art student?" inquired Arthur, with the scornful tone he used when referring to those whose walk in life was not so practical as his own. "Not exactly. I met him a little while ago by chance. When I was getting together the material for my little book on the old alchemists, I read a great deal at the library of the Arsenal, which, you may have heard, is singularly rich in all works dealing with the occult sciences." Burdon's face assumed an expression of amused disdain. He could not understand why Dr. Porhoët occupied his leisure with studies so profitless. He had read his book, recently published, on the more famous of the alchemists, and though forced to admire the profound knowledge upon which it was based, he could not forgive the waste of time which his friend might have expended more usefully on topics of pressing moment. "Not many people study in that library," pursued the doctor, "and I soon knew by sight those who were frequently there. I saw this gentleman every day. He was immersed in strange old books when I arrived early in the morning, and he was reading them still when I left, exhausted. Sometimes it happened that he had the volumes I asked for, and I discovered that he was studying the same subjects as myself. His appearance was extraordinary but scarcely sympathetic, so, though I fancied that he gave me opportunities to address him, I did not avail myself of them. One day, however, curiously enough, I was looking up some point upon which it seemed impossible to find authorities. The librarian could not help me, and I had given up the search when this person brought me the very book I needed. I surmised that the librarian had told him of my difficulty. I was very grateful to the stranger. We left together that afternoon, and our kindred studies gave us a common topic of conversation. I found that his reading was extraordinarily wide, and he was able to give me information about works which I had never even heard of. He had the advantage over me that he could apparently read Hebrew as well as Arabic, and he had studied the Kabbalah in the original. "And much good it did him, I have no doubt," said Arthur. "And what is he by profession?" Dr. Porhoët gave a deprecating smile. "My dear fellow, I hardly like to tell you. I tremble in every limb at the thought of your unmitigated scorn." "Well?" "You know Paris is full of queer people. It is the chosen home of every kind of eccentricity. It sounds incredible in this year of grace, but my friend Oliver Haddo claims to be a magician. I think he is quite serious." "Silly ass," answered Arthur with emphasis. Chapter 2. Margaret Dauncey shared a flat near the Boulevard du Montparnasse with Susie Boyd. and it was to meet her that Arthur had arranged to come to tea that afternoon. The young women waited for him in the studio. The kettle was boiling on the stove, cups and petits fours stood in readiness on a model stand. Susie looked forward to the meeting with interest. She had heard a good deal of the young man and knew that the connection between him and Margaret was not lacking in romance. For years, Susie had led the monotonous life of a mistress in a school for young ladies and had resigned herself to its dreariness for the rest of her life, when a legacy from a distant relation gave her sufficient income to live modestly upon her means. When Margaret, who had been her pupil, came soon after this to announce her intention of spending a couple of years in Paris to study art, Susie willingly agreed to accompany her. Since then she had worked industriously at Collarossi's academy, by no means under the delusion that she had talent, but merely to amuse herself. She refused to surrender the pleasing notion that her environment was slightly wicked. After the toil of many years, it relieved her to be earnest in nothing, and she found infinite satisfaction in watching the lives of those around her. She had a great affection for Margaret, and though her own stock of enthusiasms was run low, she could enjoy thoroughly Margaret's young enchantment in all that was exquisite. She was a plain woman, but there was no envy in her, and she took the keenest pleasure in Margaret's comeliness. It was almost with maternal pride that she watched each year add a new grace to that exceeding beauty. But her common sense was sound, and she took care, by good-natured banter, to temper the praises which extravagant admirers at the drawing class lavished upon the handsome girl, both for her looks and for her talent. She was proud to think that she would hand over to Arthur Burdon a woman whose character she had helped to form, and whose loveliness she had cultivated with a delicate care. Susie knew, partly from fragments of letters which Margaret read to her, partly from her conversation, how passionately he adored his bride, and it pleased her to see that Margaret loved him in return with a grateful devotion. The story of this visit to Paris touched her imagination. Margaret was the daughter of a country barrister with whom Arthur had been in the habit of staying, and when he died, many years after his wife, Arthur found himself the girl's guardian and executor. He sent her to school, saw that she had everything she could possibly want, and when at 17 she told him of her wish to go to Paris and learn drawing, he at once consented. But though he never sought to assume authority over her, he suggested that she should not live alone, and it was on this account that she went to Susie. The preparations for the journey were scarcely made when Margaret discovered by chance that her father had died penniless, and she had lived ever since at Arthur's entire expense. When she went to see him with tears in her eyes and told him what she knew, Arthur was so embarrassed that it was quite absurd. "But why did you do it?" she asked him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think it fair to put you under any obligation to me, and I wanted you to feel quite free," she cried. She couldn't help it. "Don't be so silly," he laughed. "You owe me nothing at all. I've done very little for you, and what I have done has given me a great deal of pleasure. I don't know how I can ever repay you." "Oh, don't say that," he cried. "It makes it so much harder for me to say what I want to." She looked at him quickly and reddened. Her deep blue eyes were veiled with tears. "Don't you know that I'd do anything in the world for you?" she cried. "I don't want you to be grateful to me, because I was hoping I might ask you to marry me some day." Margaret laughed charmingly as she held out her hands. "And you must know that I've been wanting you to do that ever since I was 10. She was quite willing to give up her idea of Paris and be married without delay, but Arthur pressed her not to change her plans. At first, Margaret vowed it was impossible to go, for she knew now that she had no money and she could not let her lover pay. "But what does it matter?" he said. "It'll give me such pleasure to go on with the small allowance I've been making you. After all, I'm pretty well-to-do. My father left me a moderate income, and I'm making a good deal already by operating." "Yes, but it's different now. I didn't know before." I thought I was spending my own money. If I died tomorrow, every penny I have would be yours. We shall be married in 2 years, and we've known one another much too long to change our minds. I think that our lives are quite irrevocably united." Margaret wished very much to spend this time in Paris, and Arthur had made up his mind that in fairness to her, they could not marry till she was 19. She consulted Susie Boyd, whose common sense prevented her from paying much heed to romantic notions of false delicacy. "My dear, you'd take his money without scruple if you'd signed your names in a church vestry, and as there's not the least doubt that you'll marry, I don't see why you shouldn't now. Besides, you've got nothing whatever to live on, and you're equally unfitted to be a governess or a typewriter. So it's Hobson's choice, and you'd better put your exquisite sentiments in your pocket." Miss Boyd, by one accident after another, had never seen Arthur, but she had heard so much that she looked upon him already as an old friend. She admired him for his talent and strength of character as much as for his loving tenderness to Margaret. She had seen portraits of him, but Margaret said he did not photograph well. She had asked if he was good-looking. "No, I don't think he is," answered Margaret, "but he's very paintable." "That is an answer which has the advantage of sounding well and meaning nothing," smiled Susie. She believed privately that Margaret's passion for the arts was a not unamiable pose which would disappear when she was happily married. To have half a dozen children was in her mind much more important than to paint pictures. Margaret's gift was by no means despicable, but Susie was not convinced that callous masters would have been so enthusiastic if Margaret had been as plain and old as herself. Miss Boyd was 30. Her busy life had not caused the years to pass easily, and she looked older, but she was one of those plain women whose plainness does not matter. A gallant Frenchman had to her face called her a belle laid, and far from denying the justness of his observation, she had been almost flattered. Her mouth was large, and she had little round, bright eyes. Her skin was colourless and much disfigured by freckles. Her nose was long and thin, but her face was so kindly, her vivacity so attractive, that no one after 10 minutes thought of her ugliness. You noticed then that her hair, though sprinkled with white, was pretty, and that her figure was exceedingly neat. She had good hands, very white and admirably formed, which she waved continually in the fervour of her gesticulation. Now that her means were adequate, she took great pains with her dress, and her clothes, though they cost much more than she could afford, were always beautiful. Her taste was so great, her tact so sure, that she was able to make the most of herself. She was determined that if people called her ugly, they should be forced in the same breath to confess that she was perfectly gowned. Susie's talent for dress was remarkable, and it was due to her influence that Margaret was arrayed always in the latest mode. The girl's taste inclined to be artistic, and her sense of colour was apt to run away with her discretion. Except for the display of Susie's firmness, she would scarcely have resisted her desire to wear nondescript garments of violent hue. But the older woman expressed herself with decision. "My dear, you won't draw any the worse for wearing a well-made corset, and to surround your body with bands of grey flannel will certainly not increase your talent." "But the fashion is so hideous," smiled Margaret. "Fiddlesticks! The fashion is always beautiful. Last year it was beautiful to wear a hat like a pork pie tipped over your nose, and next year, for all I know, it will be beautiful to wear a bonnet like a sitz bath at the back of your head. Art has nothing to do with a smart frock, and whether a high-heeled pointed shoe commends itself or not to the painters in the quarter, it's the only thing in which a woman's foot looks really nice." Susie Boyd vowed that she would not live with Margaret at all unless she let her see to the buying of her things. "And when you're married, for heaven's sake ask me to stay with you 4 times a year, so that I can see after your clothes. You'll never keep your husband's affection if you trust to your own judgment." Miss Boyd's reward had come the night before, when Margaret, coming home from dinner with Arthur, had repeated an observation of his. "How beautifully you're dressed," he had said. "I was rather afraid you'd be wearing art serges." "No, of course you didn't tell him that I insisted on buying every stitch you'd got on," cried Susie. "Yes, I did," answered Margaret simply. "I told him I had no taste at all, but that you were responsible for everything." "That was the least you could do," answered Miss Boyd. But her heart went out to Margaret, for the trivial incident showed once more how frank the girl was. She knew quite well that few of her friends, though many took advantage of her matchless taste, would have made such an admission to the lover who congratulated them on the success of their costume. There was a knock at the door, and Arthur came in. "This is the fairy prince," said Margaret, bringing him to her friend. "I'm glad to see you in order to thank you for all you've done for Margaret," he smiled, taking the proffered hand. Susie remarked that he looked upon her with friendliness, but with a certain vacancy, as though too much engrossed in his beloved really to notice anyone else, and she wondered how to make conversation with a man who was so manifestly absorbed. While Margaret busied herself with the preparations for tea, his eyes followed her movements with a dog-like, touching devotion. They travelled from her smiling mouth to her deft hands. It seemed that he had never seen anything so ravishing as the way in which she bent over the kettle. Margaret felt that he was looking at her, and turned round. Their eyes met, and they stood for an appreciable time gazing at one another silently. "Don't be a pair of perfect idiots," cried Susie gaily. "I'm dying for my tea." The lovers laughed and reddened. It struck Arthur that he should say something polite. "I hope you'll show me your sketches afterwards, Miss Boyd. Margaret says they're awfully good." No. "You really needn't think it in the least necessary to show any interest in me," she replied bluntly. "She draws the most delightful caricatures," said Margaret. "I'll bring you a horror of yourself, which she'll do the moment you leave us." "Don't be so spiteful, Margaret." Miss Boyd could not help thinking all the same that Arthur Burdon would caricature very well. Margaret was right when she said that he was not handsome, but his clean-shaven face was full of interest to so passionate an observer of her kind. The lovers were silent, and Susie had the conversation to herself. She chattered without pause, and had the satisfaction presently of capturing their attention. Arthur seemed to become aware of her presence, and laughed heartily at her burlesque account of their fellow students at Collarossi's. Meanwhile, Susie examined him. He was very tall and very thin. His frame had a Yorkshireman's solidity, and his bones were massive. He missed being ungainly only through the serenity of his self-reliance. He had high cheekbones and a long, lean face. His nose and mouth were large, and his skin was sallow. But there were two characteristics which fascinated her: an imposing strength of purpose and a singular capacity for suffering. This was a man who knew his mind and was determined to achieve his desire. It refreshed her vastly after the extreme weakness of the young painters with whom of late she had mostly consorted. But those quick, dark eyes were able to express an anguish that was hardly tolerable, and the mobile mouth had a nervous intensity which suggested that he might easily suffer the very agonies of woe. Tea was ready, and Arthur stood up to receive his cup. "Sit down," said Margaret. "I'll bring you everything you want, and I know exactly how much sugar to put in. It pleases me to wait on you." With the grace that marked all her movements, she walked across the studio, the filled cup in one hand and the plate of cakes in the other. To Susie, it seemed that he was overwhelmed with gratitude by Margaret's condescension. His eyes were soft with indescribable tenderness as he took the sweetmeats she gave him. Margaret smiled with happy pride. For all her good nature, Susie could not prevent the pang that wrung her heart, for she too was capable of love. There was in her a wealth of passionate affection that none had sought to find. None had ever whispered in her ears the charming nonsense that she read in books. She recognized that she had no beauty to help her, but once she had at least the charm of vivacious youth. That was gone now, and the freedom to go into the world had come too late. Yet her instinct told her that she was made to be a decent man's wife and the mother of children. She stopped in the middle of her bright chatter, fearing to trust her voice, but Margaret and Arthur were too much occupied to notice that she had ceased to speak. They sat side by side and enjoyed the happiness of one another's company. "What a fool I am," thought Susie. She had learnt long ago that common sense, intelligence, good nature, and strength of character were unimportant in comparison with a pretty face. She shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know if you young things realize that it's growing late. If you want us to dine at the Chien Noir, you must leave us now, so that we can make ourselves tidy." "Very well," said Arthur, getting up. "I'll go back to my hotel and have a wash. We'll meet at 7:30. When Margaret had closed the door on him, she turned to her friend. "Well, what do you think?" she asked, smiling. "You can't expect me to form a definite opinion of a man whom I've seen for so short a time." "Nonsense," said Margaret. Susie hesitated for a moment. "I think he has an extraordinarily good face," she said at last, gravely. "I've never seen a man whose honesty of purpose was so transparent." Susie Boyd was so lazy that she could never be induced to occupy herself with household matters, and while Margaret put the tea things away, she began to draw the caricature which every new face suggested to her. She made a little sketch of Arthur, abnormally lanky, with a colossal nose, with the wings and the bow and arrow of the god of love, but it was not half done before she thought it silly. She tore it up with impatience. When Margaret came back, she turned round and looked at her steadily. "Well?" said the girl, smiling under the scrutiny. She stood in the middle of the lofty studio. Half-finished canvases leaned with their faces against the wall. Pieces of stuff were hung here and there, and photographs of well-known pictures. She had fallen unconsciously into a wonderful pose, and her beauty gave her, notwithstanding her youth, a rare dignity. Susie smiled mockingly. "You look like a Greek goddess in a Paris frock," she said. "What have you to say to me?" asked Margaret, divining from the searching look that something was in her friend's mind. Susie stood up and went to her. "You know, before I'd seen him, I hoped with all my heart that he'd make you happy. Notwithstanding all you'd told me of him, I was afraid. I knew he was much older than you. He was the first man you'd ever known. I could scarcely bear to entrust you to him in case you were miserable. I don't think you need have any fear. But now I hope with all my heart that you'll make him happy. It's not you I'm frightened for now, but him." Margaret did not answer. She could not understand what Susie meant. "I've never seen anyone with such a capacity for wretchedness as that man has. I don't think you can conceive how desperately he might suffer. Be very careful, Margaret, and be very good to him, for you have the power to make him more unhappy than any human being should be." "Oh, but I want him to be happy," cried Margaret vehemently. "You know that I owe everything to him. I'd do all I could to make him happy, even if I had to sacrifice myself. But I can't sacrifice myself because I love him so much that all I do is pure delight." Her eyes filled with tears and her voice broke. Susie, with a little laugh that was half hysterical, kissed her. "My dear, for heaven's sake, don't cry. You know I can't bear people who weep, and if he sees your eyes red, he'll never forgive me."